Happy New Year to you all, and welcome to episode 2 of the Zoo Files. I don't have much of a preamble for this video. It's a direct sequel to the last installment in the series, so if you haven't seen that, be sure to click on the pop-up in the upper right-hand corner of this video and go watch it first. As I said in the last video, if you have any information about these animal abusers, please go to the police with it. If you send any information to me, I'm just going to report it myself, so it's best to just cut out the middleman. The following video is graphic, disturbing, and highly upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. Following his release from Whatcom County Jail in late 2012, Douglas Spink didn't have many options when it came to housing. He was broke and on high-risk federal probation, with special stipulations prohibiting him from being in contact with animals or using the internet due to the nature of his crimes. What few normal friends he once had wanted nothing to do with him. His only realistic option was to seek out fellow zoophiles, but due to the heavy surveillance he was subjected to, that was not an option that any of them were willing to entertain. Spink's calculating mind had prepared for this inevitability while confined within the walls of federal prison. He had once been cellmates with a man named Mike Finter, who was doing 10 years for armed robbery. Alongside his wife, Katine, Finter had previously run a struggling self-sustaining homestead on the Olympic Peninsula in western Washington. They were the sort of lovable, if often misguided hippies that seek to strip away all but the most essential bits of modernity in order to integrate back into a more natural and sustainable relationship with Mother Earth. Katine tended to their homestead, generating a profit and free labor by teaching classes in no-till farming, while he worked as a marine carpenter on sailing yachts. At some point in early 2009, Mike Finter became radicalized, angry beyond measure about government bailouts of big corporations while people starved and lost their homes every day. He felt it was his duty to rebel, and so he began robbing federal banks in order to reroute bailout money to unknown anti-government corruption groups. He fancied himself a modern-day Robin Hood. He was captured in the same year his spree began and was sentenced to 10 years in prison in July of 2010, within weeks of Spink's sentencing following the raid on his bestiality brothel in Sumas, Washington. The two shared a cell for a short time at the Federal Detention Center, SeaTac. Spink claims that the two struck up a friendship, which is possible, I suppose, but even if it were true, the man never knew that Spink was a serial animal rapist, for surely he would have warned his wife when she phoned him in federal prison, inquiring about Spink's character after he had shown up on their farm in early 2013, looking for housing, community, and work. Disconnected from technology and still recovering from the shock of her husband's arrest, Katine Finter had no idea that she was inviting a monster into her home when she agreed to let Douglas Spink live on her peaceful 40-acre farm. His complete lack of empathy made him an incredibly effective manipulator, and he easily slithered into her community. He took up residence in a trailer tucked away on the property, which itself was tucked away into a natural pocket of nature, secluded from the outside world. Again, the lack of diligence of his probation officer resulted in Spink having unfettered access to innocent animals, as well as being around small children daily. His home address on the farm was approved for several months before the agent assigned to his case realized he was living among a herd of some 40 sheep, and he was ordered to find a new home. He rented a house about a dozen miles away, but it was merely a front. He filed the requisite paperwork every month and paid the rent, but in reality, he never left his home base, the trailer on the farm. From it, he operated several bestiality-related websites, chat rooms, and forums. Utilizing his expertise in animal trading and technology, he began gathering his prey. He managed to track down and buy back one of his previous victims, the stallion Little Joe, which he boarded at Wild Rhodey Ranch 15 miles away in Port Townsend. He wormed his way into the trust of the stable owners and workers by offering to volunteer his services teaching children to ride horses. He formed all of his relationships under the name Douglas LeConte in order to conceal his horrifying past. The farm was having the usual trouble with managing a herd of sheep. Coyotes were poaching the livestock. Spink saw the opportunity to expand his pool of helpless victims and convinced Katine to purchase a 5-month-old Caucasian shepherd named Baka. He assured her that he had ample experience in training large breed working dogs, and she happily let him take the young animal as his ward, never suspecting the vile plans he had in store for the poor pup. Unfortunately, the nightmare didn't end there. Spink's choosing this farm presented another, unbelievably cruel twist of fate. Katine was neighbors with an exotic dog breeder named Andrew Johnston, and several years prior, in 2007, Spink had bred one of his previous victims, a boral bull named Bafana, to one of Johnston's bitches, with the promise of a free pup from the litter if Spink could provide buyers for those that remained. Spink had no buyer, and so he got no puppy. He didn't know it at the time, but Andrew Johnston saved an innocent puppy from a terrible fate that day. Bafana wasn't among the dogs seized during the raid at Spink's Sumas cabin. He was bludgeoned to death during a breaking and entering on Spink's property at some point between 2007 and 2010. At least, that's the story that he gives. Spink lived on the internet, and it only took a brief Google search to discover that Bafana's lineage was still present on Johnston's property, namely a 5-year-old boral bull Kangal mix named Genghis. Spink was brazen. He wanted that dog. He wanted to do horrible, unspeakable things to it, and he knew how to get it. He watched and waited, planned for nearly a year. He built up a trust with Genghis, slinking around Johnston's property in the dead of night with scraps of meat and bones, not a soul suspecting the unimaginable horrors that were lurking just beyond the light of their homes. During the midnight hours of February 21st of 2014, Spink made his move. He cut a hole in the fence, brought Genghis through, and stole away into the night, likely smuggling the dog to a friend in Canada and foolishly leaving a mountain of evidence behind in his trailer. For the entire duration of his stay on the farm, Spink was awaiting trial in Whatcom County for 3 felony animal cruelty charges stemming from the 2010 raid. Before he could finally be brought before the courts, the federal government once again put him in chains. Johnston noticed Genghis was missing a few days later on February 23rd, and after investigating his property, he discovered the hole in the fence that separated his land and the Fenter farm. He immediately suspected that his neighbors had stolen his dog, and so he confronted and accused Katine and her mother. When he found out that the same man who had provided Genghis's grandsire all those years ago had been living next door, he became irate, suspecting a plot for vengeance or worse. Katine had to call the police because he wouldn't stop harassing her and her mother over the incident, though personally, I can't blame him. A sheriff's deputy was dispatched to investigate the dispute. Johnston explained his grievances to the officer and then went on to question Katine. She told him that Spink had left sometime during the night 2 days earlier, taking Baka with him when he disappeared. She gave the officer his cell phone number. When the deputy called Spink and asked whether he had taken the dog, he adamantly denied the accusation, assuring the officer that even if he had wanted the dog, he already had Baka and couldn't afford another mouth to feed. The deputy wasn't particularly alarmed by the case. Animal theft was hardly exciting. He instructed Johnston to cease contact with his neighbors and assured him that he would be following up with Spink. It was only when he passed off his report to the animal control officer that all hell broke loose. The officer, Deputy Alex Mintz, was immediately put on high alert. He recognized Spink's name. The federal probation officer assigned to his case had let the department know that a high-risk felon that was banned from owning or being near animals had taken up residency in their county. Upon reviewing Spink's record, he discovered the pending animal cruelty charges in Whatcom County and subsequently contacted the feds in charge of his case to report the situation. By his own admission to an officer of the law, Spink was in violation of at least one of the stipulations of his probation. He was in possession of an animal, Baka. A week later, on March 4th of 2014, a team of U.S. Marshals, federal probation officers, and sheriff's deputies arrested Spink at the home he had registered with his probation officer a few miles down the road from the farm. He'd been missing from the area since Genghis was reported stolen. When they found him, Spink was wearing Baka's collar, and the dog was in his truck. He wasn't in great shape, but he had no major injuries, and went on to be adopted to a loving home. Spink was arrested and sent back to SeaTac to await a hearing with the federal judge for his case, the same judge who had ordered him imprisoned the previous 2 times they'd met. 2 months later, on March 9th, Spink appeared for the 3rd time before Judge Ricardo Martinez. The prosecutor urged the judge to revoke Spink's probation and send him back to prison for the remainder of his sentence. Spink used the opportunity given to him to plea for his freedom to instead bloviate about his upcoming case in Whatcom County. Quote, "I would like to say that on the Whatcom County case, that case was filed right before the statute of limitations expired. As a result of the 2010 incident, my lawyer and I are fighting that vehemently. We're fighting the constitutionality of the statute underlying that case in the strongest possible terms, and we're looking to overturn that statute on the basis of a flagrant violation of the findings of the Supreme Court in Lawrence versus Texas, as well as numerous due process violations of the statute itself. That's the status of the Whatcom County case. I'm proud to be fighting that case. I look forward to winning that case and to removing that statute from the books." Lawrence versus Texas was a landmark Supreme Court decision, which effectively ruled that laws prohibiting homosexual and other forms of atypical intercourse between consenting adults were unconstitutional. In the next video, where we examine Spink's, quote, activism, you'll notice that he and other zoophiles will often attempt to co-opt and insert themselves into the LGBT community. Needless to say, it doesn't go over well for them. At the time in 2014, Judge Martinez was not impressed either. He revoked Spink's probation and sent him back to prison for the remainder of his sentence, a short 9 months. While giving his decision, he noted that Spink was a hopeless case and one of the worst behaved felons he'd ever had to interact with as a judge. He seemed relieved that the man would now be the problem of Whatcom County. During his final stint in federal prison, Whatcom County revoked Spink's previous $5,000 bail, increasing the amount to $25,000. His latest crimes served to further demonstrate that he was extraordinarily dangerous to the public. He was briefly transferred to Whatcom County Jail so he could appear at his own hearing, where he pleaded with the judge to allow him to first finish his federal sentence before proceeding with the case. The judge agreed, and he was sent back to SeaTac to serve the remainder of his time. Days after being released, on December 4th of 2014, Whatcom County moved to resume its case against him. Spink's grandiose plan to overturn the very statute with which he was being charged never came to fruition. 7 days after his release, on December 11th, he appeared before the court to accept their plea deal. In exchange for an Alford plea, the charges would be dropped to 1 count of animal cruelty, he would receive no jail time, and he would never again be allowed to possess dogs in the state of Washington. Shortly after formally accepting the deal, in a rare move, the judge motioned to revoke the plea deal and sentenced him to 90 days in jail. Judge Charles Snyder was intimately familiar with the case and Spink's past. He wanted to send a message. Whatcom County would not tolerate the sexual abuse of animals in their community. Spink, nor others like him, would ever be safe or welcome in that community. He was allowed a few weeks to sort out his affairs and was ordered to report to Whatcom County Jail the following month in January of 2015. He never showed, and on February 26th, a warrant was issued for his arrest. Spink was a creature of habit. Just like he had in 2003 after filing for bankruptcy, he fled to Canada. His longtime boyfriend, whose identity I could not confidently ascertain, smuggled him across the border, and for the next 8 months he hid in the shadows, living in a constant state of fear. The woman who was writing his biography at the time, Corrine Maloney, met up with him, and she stayed in contact with him regularly. When criticized for letting an admitted animal rapist roam free, she will claim that she gets a free pass because she was a journalist writing a story. Despite his growing paranoid delusions and frequently recurring psychotic episodes, authorities had no leads on Spink. He had to walk right into their arms for anything to be done. On August 9th of 2015, he barged into a local business in Lambeth, a neighborhood in the city of London, Ontario. He was disheveled, wearing nothing but a towel around his waist, and was acting erratically. Onlookers called the police, and he was arrested at the scene. He was detained and gave the police a fake name. He was accompanied by a large breed dog, who police placed into the custody of the man he had been staying with, one Ronald Matuszek of Port Stanley, located 30 miles away from Lambeth. The dog would later be identified by investigators as Genghis. He was never seen again. Shortly after his arrest, the Ontario Provincial Police identified Spink as a wanted man living in Canada illegally, but due to another massive error by law enforcement, he was mistakenly released that day after his arrest on August 10th. He was rearrested the following day at Ronald Matuszek's home in Port Stanley. He was deported the day after his second arrest and placed into the custody of American officials in New York. Despite his active warrant back in Whatcom County, Spink was released by the United States border authorities. He called his mother to pick him up and stayed at her house for a few days before immediately sneaking back into Canada, again taking up residence with Ronald Matuszek in Port Stanley. He lasted 2 months before being apprehended once more. From the day he was exposed to the world as an animal rapist, Douglas Spink has tried to paint himself as a victim of the government, a victim of circumstance, a victim of a society that misunderstands and hates him. When given the opportunity, he will speak for hours or write paragraph after bloated paragraph full of pseudoscientific psychobabble in an attempt to justify his serial raping of animals. He always maintains, however, that he is not a violent person. His actions, of course, tell a very different story. Ronald Matuszek found that out the hard way. With a population of just over 2,000, Port Stanley is a tight-knit community. Ronald did not fit in there. He didn't like to be bothered and declined every invitation to mingle with his community at social gatherings. If you've ever lived in a small town yourself, you'll know that your neighbors can sometimes be aggressively welcoming. Years before Spink arrived, attempts to integrate Matuszek into the community abruptly stopped. His 2 large Italian Mastiffs had mauled his neighbor's Shih Tzu nearly to death. The dog barely survived the attack with the help of emergency surgery. After that, the strange man was left more or less alone. On November 14th of 2015, his time in Port Stanley would come to an unexpected end. Unbeknownst to his neighbors, he was again harboring the fugitive that had been arrested at his home 2 months prior. The details of what took place between the 2 men that night are unclear, but around 6 in the evening, Matuszek's house burst into flames. Concerned neighbors made their way to the house at the end of the dead-end street and found Ronald Matuszek being restrained in a chokehold by Douglas Spink. When Spink took notice of their approach, he warned that he had a knife, and if they came any closer, he would kill them all. Abruptly, he released Matuszek and ran into the house of the neighbor with the Shih Tzu, kicked in the door, ran inside, then out just as quickly, with the Shih Tzu running terrified to hide under a neighbor's deck. Her owner was out of the house at the time. Screaming, Spink started running down the street and straight into the arms of the Ontario Provincial Police. As soon as they slapped the cuffs around his wrists, he began violently fighting them. It took 4 officers to force him inside the back of a police cruiser. Once trapped in the confines, he began thrashing wildly, kicking out both rear windows and bending the radar antenna. On the drive to the hospital, he dented the back door and smashed his head full force into the plexiglass shield a dozen or so times. Once at the hospital, it took 7 officers to drag him into the facility, where he was finally restrained to a bed, screaming, fighting, and raving the entire way. 1 month later, in December of 2015, he appeared before the Ontario Court of Justice, where he chalked the incident up to PTSD he'd suffered at the hands of law enforcement in the United States. He found zero sympathy from Justice Michael O'Day. He was sentenced to 5 months, including time served. In his closing remarks, Justice O'Day implied that something much more sinister was taking place that night at Matuszek's home, and that upon serving his time, Spink would be deported. His sentence ended early in February of 2016, but he was not released. He was brought up on charges of entering the country illegally. Justice Janine Leroy wanted to tack on another 45 days to send a message to Spink and people like him, but in the end, the prosecutor convinced her to stop wasting taxpayer dollars on America's problem. It was made crystal clear to him before leaving that should he try to re-enter Canada a third time, he would face consequences far greater than he had in any other court. And so again, Douglas Spink was sent back across the border into the hands of U.S. officials in New York, and again, they released him into the custody of his mother, despite the active warrant in Washington. No charges were ever brought against Ronald Matuszczyk for harboring a known fugitive, and I can't find any criminal record for him. The fact that he was very close friends with Douglas Spink, had 2 large dogs, and was the last person to have been in possession of Genghis is incredibly worrisome. Genghis would be around 12 now, at the top end of the life expectancy for dogs of his size. Still, there is a chance he's still alive. He's an incredibly rare cross between a South African Boerboel Bull Mastiff and a Kangal Turkish Shepherd. If you think you might know where he is, I would urge you to contact his owner at the email address listed in the description of this video. As always, it was Douglas Spink's mother Claire who took him in when he had nowhere else to go. For years, she had supported him, fronting him the money to purchase his countless victims and homes. Make no mistake, this was no naive woman who refused to give up on her son. She knew what she was doing. She enabled his crimes. She was complicit in them. Each and every time he was apprehended by the law, shortly thereafter, they would receive a phone call from Claire Spink, offering to take the animals in on her son's behalf. When he needed a way to hide away Capone, she readily purchased the cabin in Sumas that would become a bestiality brothel, a rotating door of some of the sickest men in the world taking their turns at abusing Spink's animals. When the farm was raided, she offered to take in the poor beasts. When authorities were in the process of finding Baca a new home, she told them she had just the place for him. Fortunately for the animals, the idea was never even entertained by authorities. After being deported from Canada a second time, Spink went to live with his mother in Harmony, Pennsylvania. He made it less than 2 months before another violent outburst landed him back in jail where he belongs. He thought that living at home with his mother would make him feel safe again, but his paranoid delusions only grew worse. He heard voices in his head and saw people who weren't there, convinced that he was being tracked by the government. It should come as no surprise that the man who spent the better part of his adult life advocating for animal rape had a severe underlying mental illness. I'm sure his habitual drug use didn't help either. In the early hours of April 4th, 2016, he burst into his mother's room and grabbed her .38 caliber pistol, put it to his head, and began screaming that he was going to kill himself. She tried to talk him down, and he agreed to move the conversation down to the basement with her where they would be safe. Once she was down there, he bolted up the stairs and fired off 2 rounds. Thinking he'd killed himself, she rushed up after him and began struggling for the weapon. 1 more round went off during the struggle before he bolted out the door. His mother went to a neighbor's house, and the woman promptly called the police. Fortunately, his first move after fleeing the home was to ditch the pistol, though he still had 2 knives on his person. He was struck by a vehicle, causing some sort of bloody injury, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He convinced one passerby to take him to the police station, but after a short distance, the man noticed his passenger was a complete lunatic, so he booted him from the car. He tried to break into the home of a bus driver around 6 a.m. When she saw him pounding at the door, she went to fetch her gun, but by the time she got back downstairs, he was already gone, leaving smears of blood on her front door, having broken off the latch. He ended up at a buy and fly gas station where he ran behind the counter, terrifying the lone, young female clerk. Luckily, the police were hot on his tail, and his only interest was in hiding from them. Once they arrived, he fought back violently, causing around $5,000 in damages to the store and assaulting several officers. He was taken to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation where he stayed for 1 week before being formally arrested and detained in Butler County Jail. He was hit with 17 charges for the incident: 1 count of possession of a prohibited firearm, 3 counts of discharging a firearm in an occupied structure, 5 counts of aggravated assault, 4 counts of recklessly endangering another person, and 4 counts of criminal mischief. Of the 17 charges, 12 were felonies. His bail was set at $35,000, but by that point, bondsmen were aware of his past, so he couldn't post it. By all rights, this should have been the end of Douglas Spink's story, but as sure as he rapes dogs, the criminal justice system allows it. His charges were reduced to 3 misdemeanors, and he was sentenced to 1 year in jail, including time served, followed by probation for a year. A year in the can and 1 year probation for a known violent, animal-raping felon who had just rampaged through Butler County, Pennsylvania, and shortly before that, through Port Stanley, Ontario. He was released on February 7th of 2017. This time, he would last nearly a year before his next encounter with the law. After being released from prison, his first order of business was finding a fresh young victim. This time, he would choose a young Anatolian shepherd named Cav. He enjoyed his freedom for 9 months, abusing God knows how many innocent animals before his final run-in with the police. In November of 2017, a mental health warrant was issued on Spink, who had been avoiding his probation officer and mother, living alone in his SUV with Cav. Again, hammering the point home of the failure of the United States government, this convicted, outspoken animal rapist had actually registered Cav as his service animal. Great job, ADA. At around 9 a.m. on November 17th, Butler County Police responded to a call in regards to an SUV wedged inside an alleyway with a man sleeping inside. Several officers arrived shortly thereafter, woke Spink up, and began questioning him. At some point during their questioning, one of Spink's acquaintances arrived on the scene to drop off Cav. The police allowed him to bring the dog into the vehicle with him. They informed him that there was a mental health warrant out for his arrest and that he would have to be taken in for a psychiatric evaluation. He became irate. He wasn't going to lose another victim. He produced a machete and jumped out of the vehicle, brandishing it at police. They deployed their tasers. He managed to resist and jumped back into the car, grabbing Cav and pressing the blade to his neck. He told them he would kill the animal before he let them take him. Not wanting to see the animal hurt, the officers backed off to formulate a plan. They made the decision to enlist the help of the State Emergency Response Unit. For 2 hours, negotiators tried to reason with Spink, even going so far as to get permission from the hospital for Cav to accompany him. He refused, but at some point he briefly fell asleep, and police were able to coax Cav out of the vehicle. Spink bolted awake, exited the vehicle, and fell to one knee, but just as officers ordered him on the ground, he got up and charged at them. That's when they fired their guns. Sadly, they were only using beanbag ammunition. As they struggled to get him on the ground, he savagely bit the hand of one officer. Fortunately, the injury was not significant enough to cause any long-lasting damage. Like so many dogs before him, thankfully, Cav was rescued and sent to live with a family that would show him the love he deserved. Spink was again taken to Butler County Jail, and almost a year later, in September of 2018, he finally pled guilty to reduced charges for a sentence of 11.5 months in jail, including time served, followed by 2 years of probation. He also agreed to never own or be in contact with animals again in the state of Pennsylvania. After his release in October, he began a barrage of vexatious litigation against the Humane Society that rehomed Cav, the police, the prison, the hospital, and the county, all pro se and all dismissed as far as I can tell. It was also at this point that he became active on Twitter across several accounts, tweeting more frequently than any other person I have ever seen. He began networking with other zoophiles, and a few months later, on March 20th of 2019, he launched the Zooier Than Thou podcast with Toggle, who is currently anonymous. As I mentioned earlier, I won't be going in depth on the podcast in this video, but there are a few significant events I have to touch on to conclude it. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance you remember the unmitigated horror of the zoo sadism leaks of 2018, when a ring of zoophiles, many of them active members of the furry community, were exposed and exchanging and producing animal torture porn when private Telegram chats were leaked. If you've managed to repress those memories, the name Kiro the Wolf should bring them hurtling back. The contents of those leaks are far and above the most sickening messages I've ever read. and I've only seen a fraction of them. If you don't know about them, I suggest watching my friend Cecil Mcfly's 2-part expose. I will warn you, it's one of the most difficult watches on YouTube, but I think we all need to be aware of the fact that these people do exist and are still out there preying on animals and children. In September of 2018, 2 zoophiles, one known as either Akela or Pseudonym, the other as Shadow Wolf, compiled and released a large number of private Telegram chats exposing this sick animal torture ring on Akela's Twitter. Long story short, the leaks were legitimate and several arrests were made. Spink had just been released from his latest stint in prison during this time and had taken up residence on Twitter, annoying anyone and everyone that he thought may be harming his delusional zoophilia acceptance movement. Without even examining the evidence, he ruled the logs fake, doctored, trumped up, and completely false. Fortunately, even among zoophiles, no one cares what he has to say, so for the most part, his impact on the situation was zero. Half a year later, he launched his Zoophile podcast, with the first order of business after the flagship episode being the leaks. In episode 2 of the podcast, with all the confidence of an unabashed dog rapist, Spink hammers home the fact that the leaks are most likely fake and that Kiro is completely innocent.
First, connecting all of this to Kiro, who, as I understand it, is a somewhat high-profile furry, is absolutely unfair, as we are going to discuss in detail. 2, these aren't leaks, because there's no way to confirm the authenticity of what's actually been released, the majority of which is really just text files that people claim are Telegram chat logs. And unfortunately, some people involved in hyping this up last fall were actually caught circulating fake and even malware-laden documents during these claimed leaks. So there's no way to know what's real and what's fake text-wise. So it's important to be clear about what we know is real. Basically, there's some pictures and video files, as I understand it, and what's totally uncertain, namely all the chat logs and other text records that got circulated at the time.
His co-host, Toggle, claimed that the fabricated leaks caused so much anti-zoo sentiment that he had to leave Twitter, had he only stayed gone.
The leaks caused a flood of anti-zoo sentiment in a typically zoo-friendly fandom, and are a primary source of why I originally left Twitter earlier this year.
Spink then recounts his time as an operator of high-profile bestiality sites years ago, and how he used that info to help track down and neutralize individuals similar to those purported to be in the leaks, which I suppose he thought made him an authority on the matter.
As I said earlier, I used to run a high-profile, high-traffic zoo forum and tracker for years. And during that time, we had 2 incidents involving zoosadists. In both cases, I provided help in tracking down and neutralizing those individuals to the best of my ability, alongside a number of other very courageous and utterly unrelenting zoo colleagues. And what I saw during those episodes was beyond words to describe. It's fucking disgusting. I'd do most anything to stop anyone who does those things. I'd do almost anything to stop it. So I know a little bit about such investigations firsthand. I know what goes into actually acting to stop such monsters from doing what they do. And I also know just how much bullshit those monsters can and will throw up to try to avoid personal accountability. I've been there, I've done that, I've seen it, I have the scars for life from it, and I would absolutely do it again if needed to stop people from doing this kind of thing.
He brags about how he, as a genuine zoophile, has always put a stop to zoo sadists who try to infiltrate his community.
There's literally nobody, absolutely nobody, who hates zoosadists more than zoophiles. Nobody. I say this from first-hand experience. So when such monsters pop up in our world, they are swiftly spotlighted and dealt with, usually quietly, with no big public fanfare, and solely with the aim of ensuring that they don't ever hurt anybody again.
If Spink had indeed put a stop to people torturing animals, it would not have excused him from raping them himself, but it would have been a net positive if even one animal abuser was taken off the streets. I'm all for these sick fucks turning on each other. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. Spink's idea of stopping people who torture animals to death is not to report them to the police and have them arrested, it's to get them to stop abusing the animals without bringing heat to the zoophile community.
I've already disclosed my own history in working with ad hoc groups to address zoosadists in the past. For us, it's simple. It wasn't about getting lauded publicly or getting people arrested or getting people ostracized from the community. For us, success was making sure these people could never hurt another animal ever again. That's the goal, obviously. Now, short of that goal, we would deem our efforts to be a failure. That's pretty simple, isn't it?
The duo spend the rest of the episode attempting to smugly debunk the zoo sadism leaks based on Spink's expertise in taking down zoo sadists with vigilante justice. He repeatedly claims that his crusade is above the law, and is in fact more effective, because whatever vague methods he uses actually makes animal torturers stop what they're doing. Specifically, he gloats about his success in taking down 2 zoo sadists in the past, a one Randy Pepe and Rainstirs, the latter of which was widely known in the early zoophile community for producing, quote, normal bestiality, as in just rape. One of Douglas Spink's greatest weaknesses is his unrelenting narcissism. He always has to make every situation about himself and his accomplices, and it's his braggadocious, attention-seeking nature that always tends to expose his crimes. Without going into too much detail, between episode 2 and 3 of his podcast, Spink was contacted by the pair of leakers, Akela and Shadow Wolf, who informed him that there were more people involved in the leaks that weren't included in the original dump, and that they were currently being investigated by the FBI. One being a zoophile Spink was friends with, who goes by the handle Aquinas, and the other being the man Spink allegedly neutralized a decade ago, Rainstirs. Real name, Tim Amoroso. He demanded the full volume of leaks from the other 2 zoophiles, and Shadow Wolf eventually handed over the entire cache of unedited logs and various other pieces of evidence. Instead of confirming that the evidence was being investigated, Spink immediately published them, in full, across his various Twitter accounts. On April 27th, 2019, he tweeted from his Cross-Species Alliance account, quote, "Those participating in the torture of beings cannot hide their evil choices from public view. It is time to directly and irrevocably bind those torturers to their past evil acts. There is no place to hide from this. No amount of time will erase this. Hashtag torture files." As always, the result of his ridiculous posturing was a bit of bullying, and the only interactions his tweets received were, as per usual, from various sock accounts and Toggle, which is incredibly fortunate because the files he dropped happened to contain at least one exploitative image of a child, in addition to animal torture, gore, and snuff films. The following day, he proclaims victory, because the additional accounts he exposed had all gone silent upon being named publicly. Know what's funny? The torturers named in the hashtag torture files I just published have all gone silent in their little secret rooms that I have access to. Ha ha ha! Come on, boys! What's wrong? Welcome to your future. I am so glad I was able to be the one to do it. Wood. A few days later, on May 5th, after hundreds or possibly thousands of tweets sent out attempting to promote the leaks, which contained raw, unedited photos and videos of the torture porn and at least one instance of child pornography, Spink and Toggle released an early episode of their podcast going over the situation in greater detail. The pair admit that the logs were real and that Kiro was actively involved in them, but that he is innocent because he was groomed.
2 things were becoming consistent. 1, Kiro was being groomed by Snake Thing, likely since before he was a legal adult. Kiro did participate in the sharing and consumption of torture videos, but he'd have moments of clarity where he'd be disgusted with himself and try to walk away, but he'd be back again the next day. Being groomed into this stuff is a soul-crushing process, and Kiro's was steeped in it for years. That he doesn't seem to have ever ended up participating himself is noteworthy given that information.
As an aside, reading back through years of Kiro's logs and DMs, I can only say that we as a community failed this young man first and foremost. He was so young when he first showed up at Beast Forum.
Spink considers naming and shaming to be the most effective tactic, but his language indicates to me that he wants these people to destroy evidence so no one gets caught.
What I want is for these torturers to know that we have their number. I do want them to be scared. I want them to scrub their chat logs and put their severed puppy ears through the fucking shredders and clean the blood from their bedroom floors. I want them scared. Not because of some bluff, but because they can watch real time what's happening and do the math themselves. Not all of them are dumb, and the not dumb ones know full well that an irreversibly public copy of these leaked logs is the foundation for pulling in firepower from all over the world. All types of people and organizations with all sorts of diverse motivations. That's what they're facing now, a world of fury and a thirst for vengeance. That is absolutely 100% true, and that is a fearful circumstance, as they well know.
Honestly, my advice would be to tighten up your OPSEC, go underground. Cancel your meetups and take down your torture porn servers, because those are being hunted too. But technical predators are of a different order than you would ever encountered before. Feel free to delay the inevitable, but you better not fuck up. One slip up, one stray puppy limb unchecked, and you're gonna get what you deserve sooner than we'd have suspected.
As it turns out, when Spink had originally, quote, tracked down and put a stop to Rainstirs, all he had done was give the man a stern talking to. Not once, but twice. 2 times he found out this man was actively torturing dogs and puppies to death in the most gruesome way imaginable, and his solution both times was a verbal warning. Dial it back a little bit. Stick to the normal bestiality porn. This is the reality for people who do not seek help for and instead engage in this sort of paraphilia. None of what they do is okay, and they constantly seem to escalate to more extreme acts. To this day, the pinned comment on Spink's Twitter is a ridiculous rant against Rainstirs, whose real name again is Tim Amoroso. In the rant, Spink admits to knowing about Tim's animal abuse for nearly 3 decades and doing nothing about it but giving him verbal, private warnings. And to this day, Tim Amoroso is still free and actively seeking out both animals and small children to abuse. For more information, I highly recommend watching Archive the Wolf's expose on him, which I will link in the description. Her video is actually even more difficult to watch than Cecil Mcfly's, and I won't blame you if you have to skip through the explicit parts. Douglas Spink had the power to stop this man several times throughout his miserable, pathetic life, and he instead chose to put his own interests before the lives of small children and defenseless animals. Those interests being to keep law enforcement off his back and the backs of his degenerate, animal-raping friends. As we well know, he still ended up in federal and local prisons for the better part of the last 15 years for his compulsive abuse. I know it may be difficult to believe, but this story actually has a happy ending. After the Zoo Sadism update video, Spink would go on to release 17 more episodes and shorts of the Zooier Than Thou podcast throughout 2019, but as the new year came around, something amazing happened. In the early hours of January 23rd, the year of our Lord 2020, Douglas Brian Spink succumbed to his long battle with cancer and died in the early morning hours. Now, I know he was a terrible person, but it's important to remember that at his core, he was just that, a person, a very flawed person, and it's never okay to mock the death of another human being. Y'all know I'm just fucking with you. Cue the music and press S to spit on his grave. Alright, I want to believe that Spink is dead just as much as anyone, but there is a very real chance that he is still alive, and I'm going to lay out my reasons why in the next video focusing on the podcast. But for right now, let's just say that things don't really add up. To date, there is no obituary, and no one has managed to find a death certificate for Spink. Aside from his obvious motivations for faking his own death, the cocaine kingpin he snitched on to get out of jail when he was busted in 2005 should be getting out any time now. His probation with Butler County would have also conveniently expired less than a month prior to his death. On the day he allegedly died, he liked a photo that was posted at 7:58 in the evening, at least 8 hours past the time of his death. His Cross Species Alliance account was still liking tweets into February, and his various other accounts have had activity past the date of his death as well. The man was paranoid to the point where he didn't even trust his closest friends, and he had an obsession with encryption, so it's unlikely any friends or family members took over the account. And even if they did have access to them, why were they liking a random photo of a horse just hours after his death on his own account? I make no guarantee, but I will try to find a definitive answer to this question for episode 3 of the Zoo Files, and if I don't get around to it, I'll just post what I find on Twitter or YouTube. Everyone keep your fingers crossed that he's rotting in hell, but I'm not going to hold my breath. In the meantime, if you have any info that you think will be relevant to these people, you can message me on Twitter or via email, but if it's evidence of a crime, don't bother. Just send it to the police so I don't have to do it myself. And most importantly, be sure to
donate money or even a manual typewriter to me for your only hope for a future.